Welcome to another Yesterday's Airlines review video, and in this video we'll be looking at the Piedmont 727-200 N558PS by Aeroclassics from the May 2020 releases. Just like my reviews at modelairliner.com, I split these reviews into three sections. Firstly the mould, then the livery, and lastly the printing and the quality. Each section can get a score of 10 for a maximum combined score of 30. Check out my written reviews at modelairliner.com, and obviously also shout out to my own website, yesterdaysairlines.com. Loads of great information there, so check it out. Okay, so before I look at the mould, just a quick look at the history of this airframe. So you can tell by the registration N558PS that this was delivered new as a 727-214 Advanced to Pacific Southwest Airlines, and they leased this to Piedmont. Is it Piedmont? Is it Piedmont? I never know. I say Piedmont. They leased it to Piedmont in 1984. Piedmont had quite a few 727-200s they picked up on the second-hand market during the 1980s, and all of these obviously went across to US Air when Piedmont was taken over. Anyway, let's move on to look at the mould of this 727-200 from Aeroclassics. Now, I personally don't have any major issues with the Aeroclassics 727-200, but I am possibly alone in saying that there are people who have quite a few problems with this mould, and we can address each of those. So in general, the shape of the fuselage is good, the nose is excellent, the wings are also very nice, the general shape of the body and the engines mounted on the side of the fuselage work nicely, and there are no issues there. It's got the usual style of Aeroclassics undercarriage. It's not a problem for me. The gears roll. I don't really care about that, but they do. Clearly, this is a cradle mounted mould, so there is a seam line even, which runs where the wing meets the fuselage, roughly around the fairing. It's not dreadful. It's not spectacular, you know. I'd prefer not to have the seam, and you could argue that the seam on the Gemini Jet 727 is nicer. It doesn't follow the actual line of their fairing though in the Gemini Jet's version, so it doesn't really bother me. Let's say we'll lose a point for having the seam, but it's certainly not something which is a deal breaker. The area which does slightly annoy people on the 727-200s from Aeroclassics is the tail region, and there are a couple of issues here, but then again, none of the moulds in this scale get this area completely correct either. The Dragon Wings is probably the best in the tail region, but has other issues. Firstly, the line of the tail here is not quite upright enough. It should change angle at the top and move across. It does not. It kind of follows the same angle all the way up. There's obviously a seam here where the horizontal stabilizers fit in. Again, it's not a big issue for me. You could argue that the whole of the rear tail section here is slightly slumping backwards. Maybe it does to a degree, it's not enormous. But the one thing that is enormous, and the thing that does annoy quite a lot of people, is the size of the number 2 engine exhaust here, which is oversized. There's no getting away from that. It is oversized. It's not correct. And if we take it off the stand and move it down here and move in the Gemini version, which is on the updated Gemini mould, you can see the size difference between the exhausts is quite marked. You can also see that the Gemini tail sits up higher. It's actually not accurate either, and the shape of the rear section of the vertical stabilizer there is actually better on the Aeroclassics, but nonetheless, you know, overall you'd probably take the tail of the Gemini over the Aeroclassics if you had the choice. So it's not a perfect mould, it's not a dreadful mould. Most of the 727-200 moulds in this scale, in fact all of the 727-200 moulds in this scale, have issues. I think that, you know, knocking off a point for the seam, knocking off a point for not having quite the right shape of the tail, and knocking off a point for saying the size of the rear engine exhaust there, I think that this mould gets a 7. It's still a pretty good mould. I buy quite a lot of Aeroclassics 727s. I don't have any real issues with them. Okay, moving on to the livery. Piedmont's got a nice classic cheat line livery with the bird logo on the tail. Broadly, I think Aeroclassics has done okay on the colours here. They are perhaps slightly darker than the real thing, which is a typical Aeroclassics trait. If we compare to some other Piedmont models I have, you can see this is a Gemini 737 and it is slightly lighter. Same goes for the 727, but the colour matches quite well with the colours that Aeroclassics have used in the past on this 737-300, for example, and also actually matches quite well with the colours on this JetX 767, which is a pretty old model actually. So I think that the colours are okay. In terms of the rest of the livery, Aeroclassics has done a pretty decent job. I haven't got any issues with the location of the cheat line. I haven't got any issues with the main titles either. They are slanted correctly. Looks good from both sides. In that area, the aircraft itself was called City of San Francisco for at least some of its career. Aeroclassics has chosen not to show the name on the fuselage. I've seen photographs that show it and photos that don't show it myself. So, you know, I'd have perhaps preferred Aeroclassics to have chosen the city name, but they haven't done so. Also, the tail itself does have a minor issue. That's the shape of the bird on the tail. You can see it's a little bit curved. It is true that when you look at the tail of the bird, that the form of it does change somewhat in different models, and you know, when I look at photographs also of the real thing, then the curve of the bird changes. But the one thing that it does always seem to have is a flat back. The version here on this Aeroclassics, it's not quite flat enough, I think, and also it's a little bit too round on the belly. So it's not quite correct. It's not particularly bad, but it's not quite there. So I think we'll knock a point off for the shape of the bird, but otherwise I haven't really got any major problems with delivery. I'd like them to have shown the City of San Francisco, but there are photos without it, so it's not inaccurate. So we'll give it a 9 for the livery. Okay, on to the last section, and that is printing and construction quality. So on the printing front, as per usual, Aeroclassics have done a decent, if not spectacular job. There is nice detailing and no major printing failures. If I get off the stand, you can see that there's not a lot of extra added detail. There's some. You've obviously on this side got the cargo doors and such. There's some decent printing on the wings. Though interestingly, when you compare the overwing exits escape markings, you'll see that the markings on the much older Gemini release are actually nicer than on the Aeroclassics, more detailed. And that's kind of what you get with Aeroclassics. The printing's good, but it's not spectacular. They haven't gone the extra yard, and the factory isn't really as skilled in this area as it perhaps could be. Nonetheless, the printing is solid. Now, one area again that I'm not 100% happy with on the printing is the cockpit windows, and they suffer a little bit from the same syndrome that some of the Aeroclassics DC9s have, in the sense that they are perhaps slightly too low at the centre. The windows here are also slightly too large on the side, and so the two things together make the windows slightly inaccurate. You'll see when you compare to the Gemini version that the Gemini has slightly smaller cockpit windows on the side, which is more accurate, and they just look better. So Gonna knock a point off there for the cockpit windows. They're not quite as good as they could be. Build quality, as you probably saw in the previous section on the livery, one of the main gear wheels has come off. I've successfully got it reattached using a pair of tweezers. It does keep on happening with this model though. I don't usually have that sort of issue with the 727s from Aeroclassics. It's just one of those things with rolling gears, I guess. I personally don't see the need for rolling gears. They're not toys. Kids, don't roll your aeroplanes around. Certainly, if you're going to roll around, your Aeroclassics wheels are going to come off. I'm not going to knock a point off for it though. It's just something that happens. Something that I will perhaps knock a point off for though, however, is the printing quality inside the number 2 engine. I don't know if you can quite see that from here, but you can see that it is not all silver inside the engine. There is a big white mark, which, you know, just lack of a little bit of quality there on the model. So I'll knock a point off that as well. So that gives this model an 8 in terms of the printing and the build quality. That's not great, but it's not bad, and the things I'm knocking points off for aren't, you know, deal breakers. So overall, what do I think of this model? It's fairly standard for an Aeroclassics 727. It's got a good but not great mould. It's got decent but not spectacular livery application. And the printing isn't quite as nice as I'd like. But still, you've got a fairly decent model overall. So we got 7 for the mould. We had 9 for the livery. We had 8 for the printing and construction, and that gives us an overall score of 24, which is towards the lower end of good, but still firmly in the decent category there.